My talk to you today is about Abraham Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address. The Second Inaugural and the Gettysburg Address are, of course, considered Lincoln's two masterpieces. The Gettysburg Address, situated as it is in the middle of the Civil War, places that conflict in historical context. The war is part of an ongoing experiment in liberal democracy, a political project the future of which was uncertain in November 1863. The speech begins with the founding of the nation, bores down to the sacrifices of individual soldiers, provides a specific project for the living. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who have fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Then zooms out again to the political movement, government of the people, by the people, for the people, that Lincoln is trying to maintain. The Second Inaugural, by contrast, is the great articulation of the moral meaning of the conflict, placing the Civil War and its devastation into the broadest possible context. While the Gettysburg Address was all about the war, its progress and place in history, in the Second Inaugural, Lincoln unexpectedly dismisses the conflict proper with striking terseness and remarkable distance. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. This speech is, of course, best known for its peroration, with malice toward none, with charity for all, etc. It is the occupation of the high moral plane that has cemented the Second Inaugural's position in American oratory. This vision of forgiveness and reconciliation is thrilling, both in its rhetoric and in its implication. From this high ground, we see into a possible future of justice, wisdom, and virtue. And this vision is not tied to the mid-19th century, as the Gettysburg Address firmly is. This future remains possible and will always remain so. My principal topic today is this: how was this astonishing vision, and the document in which it is articulated, created? How did Lincoln attain both his insights and his power of expression? I want to first back up from "with malice toward none, with charity for all," and place this famous sentiment in its context, because within the speech, the passage constitutes a stark shift in direction. The juxtaposition is almost jarring. Yet if God wills that the war continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I'll go back further into the speech shortly, but for now I want to focus on this juxtaposition: justice as blood for blood, with justice as charity for all. One of the benefits we get from studying history is also one of the benefits we associate with studying different cultures, encountering fundamentally different habits of thought, and through that encounter, expanding our own understanding of ourselves and the people around us. Because of this difference between ourselves and those who lived in the past, we need to be aware of interpretations that are natural for us, but were not obvious or even applicable for them. For example, Lincoln's juxtaposition of justice as bloodletting and justice as mercy is easy for us to see as a juxtaposition of Old Testament and New Testament morality, the justice of God the Father versus the justice of God the Son. But this ease of interpretation for us is a result of our being born long after the Third Great Awakening and living in the midst of a predominantly evangelical conception of Christianity. To us, it is natural and obvious, but Lincoln, in part because of when he lived, was a different kind of person altogether. Lincoln was not a particularly religious man. Alan Guelzo characterizes his beliefs as a Calvinist deism. According to Guelzo, Lincoln believed in a general sense that there was a God, but he was not clear on whether or not that God was personal, or that he intervened in human affairs. Lincoln never actually joined a church, though that in and of itself may not imply as much for his generation as one might think. For example, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, also never joined a church, but his rhetoric is full of Christian references and imagery. As a young man, Lincoln was considered a freethinker, to the extent that he had to defend himself against a charge of infidelity, which he did in writing. A charge having gotten into circulation in some of the neighborhoods of this district, in substance that I am an open scoffer at Christianity, I have, by the advice of some friends, concluded to notice the subject in this form. That I am not a member of any Christian church is true, but I have never denied the truth of the Scriptures, and I have never spoken with intentional disrespect of religion in general, or of any denomination of Christians in particular. As a general rule, Lincoln preferred to avoid a direct statement about his beliefs. Note that Honest Abe doesn't claim to believe the Scriptures, only that he has never denied their truth. Later in the same document, he writes, I do not think I could myself be brought to support a man for office whom I knew to be an open enemy of and scoffer at religion. Leaving the higher matter of eternal consequences between him and his Maker, I still do not think any man has the right thus to insult the feelings and injure the morals of the community in which he may live. Leaving the higher matter of eternal consequences between him and his Maker is a similar deflection. He doesn't say leaving the matter to God, which would have been a more direct statement about his beliefs. However, during his presidency, especially as the war became more and more savage, as well as after the death of his third son, Willie, Lincoln became more and more religiously inclined. He invoked God much more frequently and looked to religion for solace. But interestingly, he almost never mentions Jesus in his writings, and Lincoln does not seem to have looked to God for salvation. Instead, he looks to God for understanding. True to his Calvinist upbringing, Lincoln sees God not as a comforter, with intense interest in individual humans, but as a being distant and inscrutable, with plans that do not center human happiness or well-being. Knowing this about him makes us understand the juxtaposition presented above more clearly. Listen to the first segment again with the passage that precedes it. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This is Old Testament morality, from a God who is distant, harsh, and inscrutable. As mentioned earlier, the second segment is easy for us to read as New Testament morality. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. But listen carefully. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to finish the work we are in. We will bind the nation's wounds. We will care for him who shall have borne the battle. We will care for his widow. We will care for his orphan. What you and I might hear as New Testament morality is for Lincoln humanist morality. The juxtaposition is not between God the Father and God the Son, but between the celestial and the mundane. The point of my reviewing Lincoln's religious beliefs is to get inside his head a bit, so that we don't mistake our religious beliefs for his, and by doing so miss the point. The humanist origins of his moral message in no way dilute its power, but now we have a question to confront. How did this man get to his moral vision? How was he able to have these profound insights and present those insights in such moving language? Certainly there is the suffering in his life, a mother's death, a sister's death, a sweetheart's death, children's deaths, 2 of his 4 sons, and so on. But the deaths of children, parents, siblings, loved ones, this is the norm in the 19th century America. Joshua Schenck, in his book Lincoln's Melancholy, makes this point. Lincoln's friends and acquaintances frequently remarked on his unusual essential sadness, and his bouts of depression were both well known and alarming. Schenck's point is that the deaths of his loved ones don't account for his melancholia. It was the depression that was remarkable. The deaths were commonplace. These external difficulties of life are not the main explanation for his wisdom and eloquence. They were and remain the common lot of man. So what is the explanation? The short answer is the humanities. Though Lincoln only had about a year of formal schooling, he pursued and provided himself with a liberal education. For example, Lincoln loved poetry. He and Mary would frequently read poems to one another, both while they were courting and after they were married. Side note, Mary should never be referred to as Mary Todd Lincoln. She did not call herself that, ever. She called herself Mary Lincoln. As I said, the Lincolns shared a love of poetry. Indeed, Lincoln wrote some poetry himself. Not his finest work, one must admit. When asked for biographical information during the 1860 campaign, he referred his interlocutor to a line from Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Courtyard, saying about his childhood, quote, "It can all be condensed into a simple sentence, and that sentence you will find in Gray's Elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor." End quote. In other words, in explaining himself, Lincoln used a poetic reference. He turned to the arts. Lincoln loved the theater, too, his Achilles heel, perhaps. Shakespeare was his favorite. He read many of his plays repeatedly. Interestingly enough, it was the leadership plays that consumed him. Hamlet, King Lear, and most of all, Macbeth. Lincoln's favorite soliloquy from Hamlet was not "to be or not to be," though he admired that one. His favorite was Claudius's soliloquy, as he fruitlessly tries to pray for forgiveness. "Oh, my offense is rank. It smells to heaven. It hath the primal eldest curse on it, a brother's murder. Pray can I not, though inclination be as sharp as will. My stronger guilt defeats my strong intent." And later, "What form of prayer can serve my turn? Forgive me my foul murder? That cannot be, since I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder, my crown, mine own ambition, and my queen. May one be pardoned and retain the offense?" Like Claudius, Lincoln speaks of offense. "Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh." Lincoln considered the offense of American slavery to be rank, an offense for which there needed to be payment before pardon. Yet if God wills that the war continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, then that's the way it has to be. And again, like Claudius, he speaks of the perhaps futility of prayer in the face of such vile sinfulness. Claudius says, "What form of prayer can serve my turn? Forgive me my foul murder? That cannot be." And Lincoln says, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue..." So it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. As I said, Macbeth was his favorite Shakespeare. At the end of the war, Lincoln regaled, if you will, Generals Grant and Sherman and others on the River Queen with readings from Macbeth, including this favorite passage: "Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well." Macbeth, the play, not the character, appealed to Lincoln's fatalism, his sense of the tragedy of life. Macbeth ruins his life by his attempts to speed destiny along and then to avoid it altogether, which he was paradoxically destined to do. Lincoln's humanistic morality is rooted in the humility of fatalism. He is said to have quoted Hamlet's, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." But I haven't found Lincoln asserting, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty." Shakespeare and the Bible were the literary touchstones of 19th century America, and Lincoln knew his Bible. So still it must be said, "The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether," is from Psalm 19. "And woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come," is from Matthew 18. Literature, secular and religious, helped Lincoln articulate his sense of the pathos of the human condition. And he loved telling stories, of course. He collected stories and told and retold them. He often used stories to illustrate a point. An idea expressed through narrative has a greater effect on the hearer than simple declaration. He understood and exploited the power of rhetoric. But there is more to how we get to the Second Inaugural than narratives. Lincoln was also known to be uncommonly rational. He was a methodical and penetrating thinker. He believed in the power of reason, and he cultivated his rationality through his study of the law. Law is a profession of logic and language, of ideas presented in words with as much precision as possible. Lawyers have penetrating intellects and are sculptors of ideas and words. We saw some of the lawyerly Lincoln earlier in the speech when he matter-of-factly explains the cause of the war. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the nation, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. The law was Lincoln's profession, but he did not rely exclusively on his law practice to hone his reasoning power. As is so often the best way, Lincoln improved his lawyerly work from the side. For example, he taught himself Euclidean geometry. He didn't need geometry in his everyday life, but through geometry, Lincoln attained greater clarity of thought, which allowed him to penetrate legal, political, and yes, moral matters. Mathematical study was the kind of mental challenge he knew he needed to grow intellectually. So Lincoln becomes Lincoln not only through a life of tragedy and disappointment, but through literature, poetry, writing, geometry, and so much else. But here's the rub. There is no straight line that goes from Gray's Elegy through Macbeth, through Euclid, to the Second Inaugural. There is no algorithm or formula for that kind of achievement. We want so much for there to be a direct connection between what we study and what we become. We want so much to be assured that studying statistics, biology, and Homer will lead inexorably to something marvelous. We act and think as if there's a straight line between where I am and where my goal is, free of extraneous diversions. First you do this, then you do that, then you do the other thing, and you end up where you want to go. What we fail to fully appreciate is that every moment is unprecedented and unrepeatable. A life has to be improvised. The world is always throwing new things at you. Some are familiar, and you've developed fluency in those kinds of situations. Others are more distinctive. When we prepare for the unknown, we don't imagine every possible situation, decide how we should react, then store that if-then algorithm for retrieval at the appropriate time. We use our principles, and then we improvise. We combine and recombine, creating and purging as we go. In part, this is what we mean when we say that a liberal education is preparation for life. We have no idea what the next moment will bring, much less the next year or decade. We have to be able to see things from different perspectives. We have to be creative. We have to be rational and rationally irrational. We have to be able to communicate, to persuade people in order to resolve conflicts and keep going. We have to make choices. More than anything else, we have to be able to tell sense from nonsense. There is no algorithm for any of that. One has to develop a feel for it, and that feel has to be developed indirectly. In the ethical realm, Aristotle speaks of phronesis, a kind of practical wisdom that we need in everyday life. John Burt, in his book Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism, puts it this way. Aristotle used the term phronesis to convey his sense that no knowledge of principles, however disciplined, however rigorous, suffices to enable one to cash those principles out in actual living. Phronesis involves a feel for particulars and a feel for nuance and qualification. It by nature resists being formalized. Phronesis is always a matter of knowing how, not a matter of knowing that, and for that reason it is a species of knowing into which one can be initiated or apprenticed, but that one cannot describe in an explicit or rule-bound way. Like every variety of expert knowledge, phronesis is essentially imprecise. Higher education generally is about developing this kind of fluency at adapting principles to unique situations. It is the mark of expert knowledge. And in the humanities, it's nonstop phronesis, because with art, anything can happen and likely will. Has algebra helped me in my career? Maybe. I do like to solve for x. Has biology? Has sociology? I'm convinced it has, but the reasoning power I gained from mathematics and natural and social sciences has helped me in ways that's hard to articulate. In my job, I need to be able to apply principles that conflict with one another under circumstances that are unique, not ideal, and not necessarily of my choosing. I honestly couldn't pinpoint exactly how I've developed what few skills I have. Much of what we learn is lost to consciousness, but much is also sent down to where our subconscious can chew on it at odd moments, until it finally connects with other seemingly lost knowledge and skills. It's a mysterious process, so we have to build our skills from different angles. But we also need to remember that our learning new things is not simply utilitarian. There's joy in them thar hills. There's joy in learning and creating. There's joy in figuring life out. And joy, strangely, may be the final secret to the Second Inaugural. Lincoln was being inaugurated. He had to say something. But the address is not merely functional. He wasn't simply fulfilling a contractual obligation. He wasn't just pushing out product. Lincoln was creating art. What he said was beautiful and beautifully put, and all beauty has an element of joy. You can imagine him taking pleasure in writing the speech, making his edits, perfecting and refining his thoughts. He sculpted a gem of lasting value, profound in its message and in its elegance. That is the essence of the arts and humanities. Deep thoughts, perfectly presented, incarnating the human spirit and asserting humanity's significance. The humanities are not ancillaries to life, but life itself, something that all of us in academia understand because at bottom all intellectual work is the humanities. For us, it is not the progress of our arms, but the progress of our ideas, the progress of the discovery, development, and dissemination of knowledge on which all else chiefly depends. So today, in that spirit, I urge you to strive on to continue the work we are in. Thank you.